George S. Patton was the most aggressive American field commander of World War II. He drove the Third Army across France and relieved American troops at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Under his leadership, they captured over 1 million prisoners and killed or wounded over 500,000 enemy troops. But by late 1945, he was politically radioactive, stripped of command for opposing denazification, openly calling the Soviets the real enemy, and planning to resign and go public against Eisenhower and Truman. On December 9, 1945, his Cadillac collided with a US Army truck at low speed outside Mannheim. He was catapulted into the glass partition, fracturing his backbone and severing his spinal cord. Everyone else walked away unharmed. The truck driver, Robert Thompson, was reportedly drunk and carrying unauthorized passengers. He was never charged, and the investigation file vanished. Patton lay paralyzed at a Heidelberg hospital for 12 days. His condition reportedly improving until a pulmonary blood clot killed him in his sleep on December 21st. He was 60 years old. Debates about his death continue. Robert Wilcox's target, Patton, alleges OSS Chief William Donovan hired Douglas Bazada to stage the crash, and NKVD agents finished him in the hospital with cyanide. Bill O'Reilly's book Killing Patton lays out the same anomalies. Mainstream historians call it an accident. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was commander of the 10th Army at Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. On June 18, 1945, the battle was nearly won, and Japanese resistance collapsed. Buckner went forward to a marine observation post on a coral ridge to watch his men finish the job. A Japanese artillery shell struck the rocks beside him, and the resulting shower of coral fragments, not the shell itself, tore into his chest. He bled out within 10 minutes. He was the highest ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in World War II. Lesley J. McNair was commander of the Army Ground Forces, the man who built and trained the US Army that fought in World War II. General Marshall called him the brains of the Army. On July 25, 1944, he was forward in a foxhole near Saint-Lô, watching the 8th Air Force carpet bomb German lines to open Operation Cobra. But several planes dropped their bombs short of their targets, and they fell on American positions. He and over 100 US soldiers were killed instantly. McNair's body was only identifiable by the 3 stars on his collar. He was the highest ranking US general ever killed by friendly fire. George C. Marshall didn't fire a single shot. He won the war anyway. As Army Chief of Staff, he built the strategy, picked the generals, and held the Western Alliance together. Churchill called him the organizer of victory. As Secretary of State, he gave his name to the plan that rebuilt Europe and won the 1953 Nobel Peace Prize. But his final months were brutal. A series of strokes left him unable to speak. The mind that had managed Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin lay paralyzed and silent at Walter Reed Hospital. He died on October 16, 1959, aged 78. He asked for a simple funeral with no speeches or public viewing. President Eisenhower broke protocol to attend. Dwight D. Eisenhower had never commanded a unit in combat when Marshall put him in charge of every Allied soldier in Europe. He orchestrated D-Day and the destruction of Nazi Germany, holding together a coalition of armies and personalities of Churchill, de Gaulle, Montgomery, and Patton. Then he served 2 terms as president. His heart had been failing for over a decade. He suffered his first major heart attack in 1955 and 7 more after. By 1968, he was bedridden in a private suite at Walter Reed Hospital. He died there on March 28, 1969, aged 78, of congestive heart failure. His last words were, "I want to go. God, take me." Maurice Rose was commander of the 3rd Armored Division, the spearhead of the US drive into Germany. In the afternoon of March 30th, 1945, Rose was riding at the head of his column in a forest south of Paderborn when they were ambushed by SS Panzerbrigade Westfalen and surrounded by Tiger II tanks. The lead jeep broke through, but Rose's was cut off and pinned against a tree by one of the Tigers. The SS tank commander threw open the turret hatch and aimed a machine pistol rifle at Rose and his aide, shouting in German. Rose, hands rising, reached for his sidearm to surrender it. The German soldier fired a burst, and 14 rounds struck him, killing him on the spot. Whether the German thought Rose was drawing to fight or simply meant to kill him at point-blank range has been argued ever since. The Germans never realized they had killed a general. Douglas MacArthur was a 5-star general and supreme commander in the Southwest Pacific. He walked off Corregidor Island with the words, "I shall return," and did. Accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the Missouri, ran occupied Japan as a near emperor for 6 years, then commanded UN forces in Korea until Truman fired him for insubordination. His farewell to Congress, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," became one of the most famous lines in American military history. But by 1964, his liver was destroying itself. He had primary biliary cirrhosis, an autoimmune disease unrelated to alcohol, and underwent 3 surgeries. Then his kidneys were failing as he lingered for weeks in worsening pain, his weight collapsing, refusing most visitors except his wife and son. He died on April 5th, 1964, aged 84. President Johnson gave him a state funeral, and he was buried at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. Frank Maxwell Andrews commanded US forces in the European theater before Eisenhower and was Marshall's first pick to lead the invasion. On May 3rd, 1943, Andrews and his senior staff hitched a ride on a B-24 Liberator named Hot Stuff, the first 8th Air Force heavy bomber to complete 25 combat missions on its return flight to the States for a massive PR campaign. They flew on toward Iceland into worsening weather. By the time they reached Kalta Arnes, snow and freezing rain had closed the airfield in, and after several aborted landing attempts in near-zero visibility, the bomber slammed into the side of Mount Fagradalsfjall. 14 of the 15 aboard died. The lone survivor was the tail gunner Sergeant George Eisel, whose ankles had jammed him in the turret and saved him from the fire when the onboard phosphorus bombs detonated. Eisenhower got the command. Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington carries his name. Don Pratt was Assistant Division Commander of the 101st Airborne, who insisted on flying in with his men on D-Day rather than coming ashore by sea. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, Pratt was in the lead Waco glider of the Airborne Reinforcement Wave, flying into Landing Zone E near Hiville in Normandy. But the glider came in too fast over a wet, sloping field and skidded into a hedgerow at the far end, crushing the cockpit. Pratt died instantly of a broken neck. He was the first American general killed in the Normandy campaign and the first general killed on D-Day. Guy O. Ford was commander of the 81st Division of the Philippine Army, an American officer in the Colonial Defense Force. When the Japanese overran the Philippines in 1942, he fought a holding action at Mindanao until ordered to surrender. He was captured in May 42 and held and tortured by the Japanese for over 6 months. When he refused to issue a surrender order to the Filipino guerrillas still fighting in the hills, his captors executed him by firing squad in November 1942. He was the only American general executed as a prisoner of war by the Japanese during World War II. Omar Bradley was the opposite of Patton, often called the GI's general. Quiet, soft-spoken, and in command of 1.3 million American soldiers in Europe, the largest body of troops ever assembled under a single American field commander. He led the breakout from Normandy and the drive into Germany. He kept rising after the war, running the Veterans Administration, then serving as Army Chief of Staff. He was promoted to 5-star general in 1950 and outlived almost everyone he had served with: Eisenhower, Marshall, MacArthur, and Patton. On April 8, 1981, aged 88, he was in New York to receive an award from the National Institute of Social Sciences. He collapsed at the venue from a cardiac arrhythmia and was pronounced dead later at the hospital. He was the last American 5-star general. None has been promoted since. Millard F. Harmon was commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Pacific Ocean areas, second only to Hap Arnold in air authority in the theater. He oversaw the strategic bombing buildup against Japan in its critical phase. On February 26, 1945, he took off from Guam aboard a C-87 transport on a flight to Hawaii. Somewhere over the Central Pacific, the aircraft simply vanished. No distress call, no wreckage, no oil slick. The largest air-sea research of the war to that point turned up nothing. Harmon and the 11 others aboard were declared dead a year later. He remains officially missing in action to this day, one of the highest-ranking American officers ever lost without trace. Curtis LeMay was the architect of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. He switched from B-29s from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks at night. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed roughly 100,000 people in a single night. He also oversaw the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then built Strategic Air Command into the most fearsome nuclear strike force in history. He retired in 1965 after clashing with Secretary of Defense McNair over Vietnam, and made an ill-judged run for vice president in 1968. He then spent 2 decades in retirement in California. He died of a heart attack on October 1st, 1990, aged 83, at the hospital at March Air Force Base, among the bombers he had built his career around. Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell was commander of US forces in the China-Burma-India theater. He spoke fluent Mandarin and spent the war fighting the Japanese, the Burmese jungle, and constantly clashing with British commanders plus Chiang Kai-shek, whom he privately called the Peanut in his diary. After the Japanese drove him out of Burma in 1942, he walked his staff 140 miles through the jungle to India. But by 1945, his forces had pushed the Japanese back across the Burma Road. He died on active duty. In summer 1946, while commanding the 6th Army at the Presidio in San Francisco, he was hospitalized for what doctors thought was liver trouble. Exploratory surgery revealed advanced stomach cancer already spread through his abdomen. He died on October 12, 1946, aged 63. At his request, there was no funeral, no honors, and his ashes were scattered off the California coast. Henry Hap Arnold was commander of the US Air Forces, the only man to ever hold 5-star rank in both the Army and the newly independent Air Force. He built American air power from a 20,000-man branch into a 2.4 million-man force that dropped more bombs than any Air Force in history. But his heart couldn't keep up. He suffered 4 heart attacks during the war itself. A 5th in 1945 forced his retirement. He moved to a ranch in Sonoma, California, to rest. He died there on January 15, 1950, aged 63, of his 6th heart attack. Matthew B. Ridgway was commander of the 82nd Airborne at Sicily and Normandy, then of the 18th Airborne Corps at the Bulge, where he fought through Europe with a hand grenade strapped to his harness. Later, during the Korean War, he took command of the struggling US 8th Army after a series of defeats by Chinese forces. He restored morale, stopped the retreat, and led a successful counter-offensive that recaptured Seoul and pushed North Korean and Chinese forces back. He died at his home in Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania on July 26, 1993, of cardiac arrest. He was 98 years old, the last senior American commander of World War II to die. He was buried at Arlington with his master parachutist wings still on his uniform.